All right, Michael, thank you for joining me. We're going to launch here in this survey, this general survey of the philosophy of nature and man. And so in this first lesson, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just situate a little bit what the scope of the natural philosophy is. I'm going to start distinguishing it a little bit from the work of science, of natural science, or the empirical sciences. And I'm going to mention what are the major assumptions that we make here. And then, as I foresee it in the next lesson, I will place this in a broader historical context. You know, what is the tradition of the natural philosophy in its historical context, and then I will give an outline of the remainder of the sessions. Okay, so if I can get my clicker to work, here we go. All right. So, you know, I use the term natural philosophy, which can mean different things, and through the ages has meant different things. But I'm referring particularly to a certain tradition, a certain philosophical tradition that also nowadays goes by the term Aristotelian-Thomistic, with a nod to the major contributors to that tradition, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. And it's helpful to mention these two figures just because of their their tremendous contributions. Particularly Aristotle. When we talk about natural philosophy, it's particularly Aristotle. Although I think Aquinas did make some contributions, but much of his work has been to clarify the thought of Aristotle, because anybody who's tried to read Aristotle, and it's, you know, it can be very confusing, and there's been a lot of commentators on Aristotle over the years and over the ages, and so Thomas has, I think, and for those of us who follow that tradition, you know, believe that Aquinas has really clarified the principles of natural philosophy from Aristotle, but so even though we hold as important the authority of Aristotle and Aquinas, you know, it's still it's a philosophy that is, as I will discuss it in a moment, rooted in reason, and therefore, you know, every human being fallible can make, you know, errors of reasoning, and so, you know, the work of the natural philosopher is to think through critically, you know, all the propositions of natural philosophy, and not necessarily take them as authoritative just because they've been uttered by our authorities. But it's a nice, I think it's a nice shortcut to distinguish other uses of the term natural philosophy that were invoked primarily in the aftermath of the modern revolution. And so, you know, Leibniz was calling himself a natural philosopher, and many philosophers after, you know, in the early modern period used the term natural philosophy, but they were it was a very strong departure from the tradition of Aristotle. And so, and then nowadays, hardly anyone uses the term except the Aristotelian-Thomists. So for the most part, I would use the term natural philosophy to mean, you know, natural philosophy in the Aristotelian-Thomistic tradition. Okay. Now it's a tradition, and it's not a set of mathematical derivations. It's in the nature of philosophy that that it doesn't have the same kind of precision as mathematics, and we'll get into that later on. You know, the making the distinction and situating where mathematical knowledge comes in, and how it's distinct from philosophical knowledge. And even though mathematical knowledge is more compelling for the truth of mathematics, the truth that it reveals, at the same time, mathematics cannot be the end-all be-all, or cannot be the starting point, because mathematics is not about, you know, anything in particular. And so we have to rely on philosophy, despite its shortcoming, as a sort of more fundamental explanatory framework to talk about the world. Okay, so it's a subject of discussion and disagreements, ultimately rooted in reason, and it continues to flourish today, and I will get into that as we go along. Okay, so the scope of natural philosophy is a systematic reflection about the world and about ourselves as part of the world. Okay, so it's here is very important to highlight that it's systematic, so it's quite ambitious, and people who are not familiar with it nowadays may view this statement with a lot of skepticism, right? How can we be so systematic? It seems far-fetched and unattainable, and in many ways, the modern thought has given up on the ability to really have a comprehensive, systematic view of the world. And I'm not saying that we've achieved it yet, but certainly that's the aim. And I think it's not so foolhardy as it may sound at the moment. But anyway, so it's a systematic reflection about the world and about ourselves as part of the world. So we are aiming for a very comprehensive framework of explanation for everything around us. We use reason and sense experience in a very general term, okay? And we'll see how that works when we get into it. Now, of course, the empirical sciences also use reason and sense experience, but natural philosophy is very distinct, and I'll spend more time about the distinction between natural philosophy and the empirical sciences later on. But here, just to get started, natural philosophy is really provides very general explanatory principles deduced on the basis of very general observations and explicit assumptions. And I'll get into the assumptions just shortly, but it's just very, very general, right? So we're not about precise details of the workings of things in the cosmos, but some general explanatory principles. The empirical sciences, on the other hand, are explanatory models focused on the quantifiable aspects of nature, and generally requiring empirical validation. Okay, so we will see, again, now it's a little bit abstract, but as we go into it, we will see that there's a very distinct approach, and that the two are really distinct and complementary and not autonomous. Natural philosophy, on its own is not going to capture everything that we need to know about the world, and the empirical sciences on their own, again, are not going to be able to capture everything. And so philosophy and the sciences need one another. So they're really complementary, and they help one another. They act as safeguards on one another, so to speak, because natural philosophy needs the input of the empirical sciences to refine itself, and the empirical sciences fundamentally need natural philosophy, the principles of natural philosophy, to make sense about what they reveal, because frequently they actually there are many scientists right now do a lot of things under certain assumptions, and those assumptions have to be made explicit ultimately, and they can only be made explicit on the basis of philosophical reasoning. Okay. All right, so I want to touch here on something that is distinct to the starting point in natural philosophy, and it's actually distinct from the empirical sciences. As I said, so natural philosophy is going to be a systematic reflection about the cosmos and about man and our human beings and our place in the cosmos, etc. So it's a systematic reflection. But the starting point of that reflection is going to be the personal and quote-unquote public experience, meaning we start from ourselves and what we know, and then expand to the world around us. And it's very different from the empirical sciences, where physics will start with the stuff out there, the body falling or the molecule of water or this and that. And then the empirical sciences seem to work from the very, very simple stuff to the more complicated stuff, then leading up to maybe cognitive neuroscience or something like that. Here, the approach is the other way around. I have a quote here from Aristotle, the first chapter of Aristotle's Physics. Say we start from the things which are more knowable and obvious to us, and then proceed towards those which are clearer and more knowable by nature. Meaning, we have to start at some level with what we understand, or what we know best. And what we know best is what we experience as human beings. Now, that may seem very subjective and prone to cognitive biases and things of that nature. But really, when we take our own personal experience as the starting point, we don't mean here our own very, sort of subjective experience. We assert that as human beings, we share a common and what we call here public experience. We recognize that we have senses, that we receive knowledge through our senses. We recognize that the world around us is a changing world, so there's change in the world and that sort of thing. And so this personal experience, even though it is personal, we're going to start with the very, very basic facts of that personal experience, and not get into things that are entirely subjective. Again, at this point, this may seem very abstract, but as we roll up our sleeves, in a couple of lessons and start working in the work of natural philosophy, this will become important, that we do start with what we know as human beings, what we seem to know and seems to be fundamental, or at least uncontroversial. There are so here I'm going to talk the next couple of slides about the assumptions, right, and the basis for natural philosophy. It's realism and intelligibility. So realism, so this is a philosophy of realism. It's an assumption. We can't prove it, but we are starting with the assumption that the cosmos is not an illusion, that it's not magical, that it's not a construction of our minds, right? That there's actually real stuff out there independent from our minds. Okay, so realism, that is an assumption in the natural philosophy, in the Aristotelian-Thomistic natural philosophy, is that the world out there is independent of the mind observing it and making statements about it. So it's very different from Kantian philosophy or other either modern or ancient philosophical traditions. Okay, so it's realism is one of them, and the second one is intelligibility. And intelligibility is really the assumption that the world out there, the cosmos, the world around us, is accessible to our minds, that it is comprehensible, it is intelligible, that we can actually say things about it that are true. Okay. So the principles of intelligibility, again, cannot be, those are assumptions. I cannot prove that the world is intelligible. But I have to, on the one hand, if we do philosophy and we want philosophy to be meaningful, I mean, it seems to be obvious that we assume that the world is intelligible. Intelligibility becomes, again, here at this point, it seems very abstract. Later on, I think it will become clearer why it is important to be very explicit about the fact that we believe that the cosmos is intelligible, because there'll be places where we will have to refer to our principles of intelligibility to make some advances and to pursue our natural philosophy. The question of intelligibility is frequently articulated around two principles. The first principle is a dual principle. It's the principle of identity and of non-contradiction. You can get one from the other. I mean, there's they go together. The second principle is what is called, or can be called, the principle of sufficient reason. And I'll go into those two principles next here. Sorry, the other way. The principle of non-contradiction is simply the statement, can be stated as, no real being can both be and not be at the same time and in the same aspect. This is the general principle of non-contradiction. I don't think it's controversial. I mean, it seems to be a very compelling aspect, whether it's an aspect of our mind or of reality. As realists, we think that it's an aspect of reality. We think that the principle of non-contradiction describes something about the world out there, that no real being can both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. And in many ways, the sciences accept that principle of non-contradiction as well. I mean, this is, again, not, I don't think it's controversial, but it needs to be stated as such and be made clear. Along with the principle of non-contradiction is the principle of identity, which essentially acknowledges that if we're talking about the cosmos, if we actually begin to have a conversation about things out there, we acknowledge that there's a diversity of existing beings, and each being with its own wholeness and unity, and therefore each being has an identity. Each being is a this or a that, okay? And if it's a this, it cannot be at the same time a this and a that at the same time and in the same respect. It's either a this or a that. Again, I'm just touching on these principles, and I'm sorry if it seems to be a little bit abstract, but when we get back, into more concrete work of natural philosophy, this will become helpful. So the principle of these two principles together, non-contradiction and identity, have been called the principle of static intelligibility. It's about the fact that the cosmos, things are or are this or that, and they cannot be, both that and not that at the same time and in the same respect. There's a principle of dynamic intelligibility, which is also called the principle of sufficient reason, and that can be formulated as follows: every being has the sufficient reason for its being, either in itself or in another. Again, very abstract at this point, but really what it is that if we're talking about a phenomenon, if we're talking about something, if we're making a statement about the existence of something in the world or in the cosmos, or the coming to be of something, or the vanishing of something, these things have to have a reason for their existence. And either that reason is immanent in the thing itself, or it has an explanation, which we are going to seek. And again, it's not so, a less careful way of that. I mean, nothing pops in and out of existence without. So the world is not magical. We don't have rabbits coming out of a hat without explanation. Okay, if we see a rabbit coming out of a hat, we're going to, assume that there's an explanation or a reason. And if the coming out of the hat of the rabbit is not contained in the rabbit itself, if the rabbit is not the sufficient reason for its coming out of the hat, then there must be another reason why the rabbit is coming out of the hat. So this is just a very simple. Again, it cannot be proven. We cannot prove that the cosmos is intelligible in that way, dynamically intelligible. Okay, but we assume it. And again, this is something it's an assumption that is shared by the empirical sciences for the most part. The empirical sciences, let's setting aside right now the controversies about quantum physics and whatnot. We will say that the empirical sciences share the same assumption, that the world is intelligible, and if there's a phenomenon that requires an explanation, we're going to seek an explanation for it in one way. When I use the term principle of sufficient reason, it's a little bit of a controversial terminology, because also, again, in the modern period, it was used by certain philosophers. Again, Leibniz in particular has used the principle of sufficient reason in his own ways, and that's not the way we use it here. But we have to be careful. If somebody in the audience is familiar with this principle from studying modern philosophy, I just want to caution you that we mean it in a very specific way here. And I think that's about all I have to say for this first lesson. In the next lesson, I will get into, I will give a little bit of a broader history of the tradition of natural philosophy through the ages, starting not only with Aristotle, but with Aristotle's predecessors, and how he was responding to his predecessors, and how that tradition developed over the ages. And then I will give an outline for the remainder of this survey of natural philosophy. Any questions, Michael, before we stop here?
I don't know if I have a question. It was helpful to me when you alluded to different thinkers for purposes of comparison and contrast. When you were talking about Aristotle's starting point, we start with ourselves and the things that are most familiar and then proceed to the outside world or something. That sounded kind of Cartesian to me, for example. And it would be interesting to hear at some point.
Correct. It's actually it's a good point, but it's not Cartesian. And we'll see the reasons why. I mean, we'll take on Descartes sort of head on, but Descartes was clearly a departure from Aristotle. So there's a reason why, even though on the surface it sounds the same, there's a reason why it's not. Because in Descartes there's a fundamental dualism within the person. You know, you have the thinking thing, you know, the soul, which is thinking, the mind, and the body, which is separate. And that's not the case. In fact, the fundamental contribution of Aristotle is to highlight the intrinsic unity of, the body and the being, you know, with the principle of act and the principle of potency being together, which were separated by Descartes. And so Descartes was trying to look for clear and distinct ideas, right? By reflecting and trying to make complete abstraction of the physical and the material. And for the Aristotelian, really, that's a non-starter, and it doesn't really reflect the reality of our experience, because our experience, we don't experience ourselves as being two distinct beings. But I'm glad you brought that up, because you're right.
You wonder if Descartes experienced himself as two distinct beings.
He might. He might. So no. But the starting point is that, you know, we don't. What I can point out is here we don't understand we don't know what it is to be a water molecule. We don't know what it is to be an atom. Okay, so even though we are made of water and made, at some level we're made of water and atoms and all that stuff, we don't know what it is to be the stuff out there. We know certain things, that are very familiar with us, and we seem to share with one another because we can talk about them, and we seem to have the same. So there's a public experience, an experience that seems to be. Now, of course, somebody can deny that having the same public experience, and somebody can say, no, I happen to be floating outside my body, and that sort of thing. And I can't argue with that person, right? A person who would hold what seems to be a very distinct public experience from the rest, there's not going to be a way to communicate. But barring that, if we have if we acknowledge a common experience, that in a way is the starting point at a very, very general level of what that experience is. Okay.
That's a helpful answer. I don't think anyone would ever have confused Descartes with Aristotelianism.
Right. But you make a good point, yeah, from the way I phrased it, that it can invoke that Cartesian approach of looking for clear and distinct ideas inside the mind.
Yeah, I mean, there were other points where I was wondering, how does this relate to, let's say, phenomenology or something? But
right,
I'm sure that can wait for future.
It can wait. I want to, many people, you and many people in the audience, I think, will have had some exposure to modern philosophy and physics, and will be itching to sort of understand the connection or how that contrasts to. And I'm going to ask, perhaps, I welcome questions, but at the same time, I'm going to say, let's just wait. Until things develop, and then things will become clearer as we go. All right. Okay. Thank you, Michael. See you next time.
You're welcome, Michelle.